I always tell people about the fact that many people in the Philippines are great storytellers. And in my family, I was kind of blessed to have a grandfather who loved to write. He wrote poetry. He was a wonderful artist. He liked to sketch with pencil, and beautiful sketches. I still have them today. And my mother was a painter, and but also quite a storyteller. And I always like to link it to the Filipino love of chismis, or gossip, right? That really the gossip is a way to tell these very emotional and dramatic stories, and they sort of get embellished as they get passed down and around. And I grew up with that around me, and also a real love of books in my family. So when I was, very little, I remember always being surrounded by books, all kinds of books in the house. My father was a voracious reader. He liked to read novels, and I would wander into my parents' room, and he'd be reading, and I was fascinated with that. And that my grandfather, however, my maternal grandfather, who was an American from Illinois and who had gone to the Philippines as a teacher, and met my grandmother and ended up living there, of course. He always told me stories and would sort of sit me down, and I hung out with him all the time. I loved him to death, and followed him around like a dog, kind of just everywhere. He was my, my idol, what can I say? So he would be like my first mentor, I think. And I would draw with him and write stories, in my own little childish way. And we'd fold the paper and we'd make like these sort of 4-page books, he'd call them. And I just decided, maybe from the age of 7 or 8. I think 8, though, I was really like, I'm going to be a writer when I grow up. I mean, I know this. Whatever else, I also loved the theater, and I loved play acting. But I knew in my heart of hearts, above all that, was the writing, and that I wanted to make books. And I wanted to write poems, and that was just going to be that. I mean, nothing was going to stop me. And nobody sort of acted surprised. They were like, oh, she's just like her grandfather, Great. So when we came to the United States, my mother and my brothers and myself, which was not a happy occasion, because my family had split up, my parents had split up, and my father stayed in the Philippines. And my mother, who had family in California, decided to, let's see what that's like. And I was not happy with the abrupt way we left the Philippines at all. I was quite isolated. I was a teenager. I was 14 years old. It was not a great way to be uprooted, and not the best time of one's life, I suppose. So I began reading even more. I mean, reading was sort of my way out of feeling unhappy, and writing was my way to express myself. I didn't have many friends. I didn't know anybody. I had one cousin, but she was way older than me, so it wasn't like I could hang out with anybody my age. I was still getting to know the kids at my new school, but it was a real I was still trying to adapt to this new life in San Francisco. So I wrote a lot of poetry and these weird little plays. I had sort of stumbled upon Edward Albee. Don't ask me how. I mean, how does a kid from Manila, I think I read about him in the newspaper or something, and I thought, oh, he sounds interesting. So I went out and bought his plays, And my mother indulged my passion for books. Books were cheap then, paperbacks. So, it was like, well, if she's a little happier going out and buying a book a day, let her have it, So I was reading plays a lot, and I read his plays, and I really loved them. Even though I didn't quite get them, I got them, and I said, well, I'll start writing plays. And so I was writing poems and plays and, not really writing a lot of prose. And going to high school, around age 15, 16, a friend of my mother's read my poems, because she was always showing them off, and he was he became our family doctor, and he said, oh, I know somebody who I think would appreciate this. And I sort of thought, who, and what, and who cares, because I was like sulking. And he sent it to a friend of his who worked at the San Francisco Chronicle. I think it was the Chronicle or the Examiner, one of those newspapers at the time. She was an editor there, and she gave them to Kenneth Rexroth, who at the time was writing an arts column, you know, about whatever popped into his head. And he called us up, and he wanted to know, you know, did we want to all have dinner together? I mean, it was sort of this thing out of the blue. I didn't even know who Kenneth was, so I had to sort of, there was no Google then, so I was like, oh my God, who is this man, you know? And our family doctor told me, oh, this is wonderful, you know, he has this column, but not only that, he's a, you know, a very respected poet, this and that. So we met, and Kenneth sort of became this great force in my young life. He, I would say he's really responsible for, you know, my big step into poetry and starting to feel like maybe I was part of the American literary something back then. Because I did not have a clue. I mean, I was very open. And he just, you know, he happened to live in the neighborhood. We lived in the Haight at the time. And he lived on Scott Street, which was walking distance. And he invited me over. He said he had a daughter my age. And he said, look, anytime you want, you can come after school, come over to the house, you know, and you can borrow books. He had a library of 10,000 books. I'll never forget that. You know, poetry books, novels, things in different languages. And he said, you can just borrow things and bring them back. And, you know, he gave me stuff. And then he started taking his daughter and me to readings, poetry readings. I mean, she was an old hand at this stuff, but it was like she was my, you know, she kept me company. And he took us to coffee houses. And I'd never been to a poetry reading. I thought it was so odd. These poets standing up, you know, in front of a microphone, and some of them did it to music. And I thought, wow, you know, beatniks, this is so fascinating. And he got up to read. You know, of course, people would be like, oh, he's in the audience, you know. And they'd invite him up. And I thought, well, this is really interesting, because it's not just getting up there and reading your poetry. He's sort of performing it, you know. So I was totally, like, riveted. And then he took me to City Lights bookstore, which, of course, was wonderful, because it was open till midnight. It still is. I love that place. And he, you know, he knew everybody there, of course, and he said, well, you know, you can come here and read. I mean, this is before Barnes & Noble, so it was the only bookstore I knew of where they would actually not mind if you sat there and just read, and they made no money off you. You know, so I was totally just enchanted. And we would be in North Beach, of course, where City Lights bookstore was located, and he'd walk us around, you know, and he'd sort of talk to people on the street, and they were all writers or painters or musicians, and I was just, I felt so grown up. And, but the most important thing is he took me seriously as a writer, or wannabe writer, and he guided me, and sort of then when I was 20 or 21, I think, that's when he decided he would put together this anthology, which was my first published. I mean, I had done, I was in another anthology that was, you know, a small press anthology, but this one was done by McGraw-Hill, and I'm sure it was because it was Kenneth, not, you know, and he chose 4 of us, 4 women. It was called 4 Young Women Poets, and the other 3 had been his students at Santa Barbara, when he taught there briefly at UC Santa Barbara. I never went to college or anything, you know. I went to theater school. I mean, I sort of thought college was the antithesis of writing in those days, so I just didn't go. But these 3 other women had studied with him, and so he really loved their work, so he put us all together. And that was the beginning, you know, of, it was kind of an odd feeling to have a book. It was unreal to me. And the whole time it was in process, when, you know, contracts, I didn't even read the contract. I mean, I just remember signing something. You know, that's how naive we all were. And then it became, McGraw-Hill went from hardcover to paperback by a press called Seabury, that I don't think is around anymore, but I didn't even, you know, it was like, whatever, you know. It was so weird, I mean, because I had not a clue, you know, how wonderful this really was, you know. And So that was the beginning of the writing life, really, I think. Thank you, Rex Roth.